Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for the invitation. And sorry for being late at the beginning. It was just not looking at the watch. And in Bolivia, there's a saying where people say the people of the countryside, the indigenous people of the countryside, indigenous people of the cities, they have the watches, and the people of the countryside have the time. So time can be very different, which of course will not make or is not an excuse for being late, but it's just like for something what I also want to talk about is linking the avant-garde term to the question of time, and I will make this at the example of popular dances in Bolivia. And now I just should find, but it's not there, my PowerPoint, but I cannot give it, share it on the screen. Ah, now it's there. Okay. Now it should be there. Do you see it? I hope so. Yes. And if there is, moment. And now it should be great. Well, thanks again for the invitation to Sara Pogoda and to Zoe Scalding. And I'm very, very pleased to be with you and that I can share some thoughts which are still maybe not that much elaborated in detail, theoretically or scientifically, but which I see as an important aspect or considerable aspect to see if we want to talk about avant-garde, and therefore I will talk about challenging the persisting echoes from the past popular culture in Bolivia as decolonial avant-garde practice. And as the title shows, my intention of the presentation is to link the past with the term of avant-garde. The idea is normally mostly linked to the future, and as there was also in some glances shown by the speakers before, is all the questions always around that: is it a certain form of reenactment, avant-garde, or is it something new to come, and the past is to be perished? So we have always this question of time. And in the case of Bolivia, popular culture, and the case of contesting the colonial system in Bolivia, traditional, the interesting thing is that traditional popular culture and dances played and play in the present a very important part of, in my eyes, of challenging the system and being avant-garde for a new and other and different definition of places and territories in a decolonial notion, and so for a society to come. And I want to make at the beginning, I want to outline the constellation of the South American country, Bolivia, which was not only an experience in Bolivia, but the whole continent, but in particular about what happened in Bolivia. In the highlands, the southwestern part of Bolivia, formed before the colonization part of the Inca Empire, and it was the Coya Suyu. The Inca Empire was divided in 4 parts, and the southern part was called Coya Suyu, while the whole Inca Empire extended for a bigger, or almost the size the European Union is having nowadays. It's going from the north, from Colombia to the Caribbean, from Colombia till the south, not the south, but the northern part of Chile, parts of Chile and Argentina, which were all parts of the Inca Empire. So in the process of colonization, the whole area of the highlands was occupied by the Spaniards, the Spanish formers, and they aimed the occupation, or the aim of the occupation, were the resources, the silver and other precious metals which they found there, or which they were told that they are to be found there. And in particular, it was the Cerro Rico, where you can see the picture, a mountain in Potosí in the south of the nowadays Bolivia. and especially in Potosi, the Cerro Rico supplied Europe with silver and was placed for the first rush of precious metal in colonial history. And it was long before there was, for instance, the gold rush in California in the 19th century. So Eduardo Galeano describes in his book The Open Veins of Latin America, the Cerro Rico, as a summit of no return, where 7 out of 10 forced workers did not return from their half-year lasting shifts, which they were driven into the mountains, and 7 out of 10 didn't return after half a year working within the mountain. And while the indigenous population died in the mines those days, Potosi became one of the biggest cities in the Western Hemisphere in those days, with 160,000, a population of 160,000 persons at the beginning of the 17th century, and it was a higher population than Madrid in those days. So it was even though considered to big cities in other world regions, was a very, very big one. So generally, the colonization took place in 3 steps. It was firstly the military occupation in the 16th century by defeating the Inca army and killing Atahualpa, the last Inca, in 1536. Then destruction of the culture. First the materialist culture, the bricks, the temples and the palaces, and building cathedrals upon the temples, like you can see nowadays in Mexico City, for instance. The central cathedral of the city is built up this principal temple of the Aztecs, and the same has happened to Cusco in Peru, where they built the palace on a cathedral on the Inca palace after the occupation. And this was the first step. The second step was then to destroy immaterial cultural goods, like to forbid talking in an indigenous language after a time, destroying or not allowing cultural practices like rituals and stuff like that. And at the last step, there was the colonization of the body, which took place at the end, and which Compass states was some sort of taking away the soul and creating an identity which is ready to serving for the colonial, serving in the mines, but also in the households of the rich people. So everything, the whole place and the whole territories, body and place were designed for a colonial extractive system within this colonial process in Bolivia. And this is basically some historical references I want to make. And there's the second reference, which is theoretically to define the colonial place, which I want to state, to quote three people, Achille Mbembe, Homi K. Baba, and Fernando Montes Ruiz. No? Achille Mbembe has the concept of necropolitics, which is oriented at Foucault's biopolitics, and he describes the plantation system as an order with geographically divided zones of living and death. The colonial scheme for him splits places into different zones for the colonized and zones for the colonizers. The colonial system creates gated worlds and to lock up enslaved people in work camps such as plantations. For Mbembe, the slavery system at the plantations in the US are the blueprint for nowadays neo-colonial system of separated places. Of course, the system has changed and developed and make circles since this time. But the idea to put people into separated places originates in his eyes from this time. And he complements with this, as I already said, the idea of biopolitics of Foucault and the control of body with the concept of control of place. The second one is Homi K. Baba. Homi K. Baba has the conception of colonial space as a cultural place dominated by the colonizer. The colonized is culturally seen and defined through the gaze of the colonizer. The option the colonized person has is to abscond from the gaze of the colonizer, and there's no other option to contest the definition of representation which is made in the colonial space. This means disappear and for the colonized person and reject the form of representations by the colonizer. Baba operates in his draft of place with the concept of diaspora, the identity of the colonized person in diaspora is an identity without origin. The colonized person has no roots of reference. They have been cut by colonizations, which is, as I described at the beginning, the cut is by totally occupying territory, immaterial, cultural life, and also bodies. So in the case of Bolivia, it was the term, in particular, Indio, which marked the colonized, as I mentioned, as I mentioned before. And Indio means a person with an inferior intellect. Baba says, by adopting the diaspora identity, the colonized person is able to create a gap, a third space, and this is the idea of a central idea of Baba, which rejects this colonial attribution of the Indio. And finally, I want to point out the idea of Fernando Ruiz Montes Ruiz, who is a Bolivian anthropologist, unfortunately not so known abroad of Bolivia, but I think he's really interesting his work, and he completes the analyzing of colonial place from a Bolivian point of view. In case of Bolivia, colonial dominance was never absolute. Even though I pointed out that there was all this movement of destructions, but the sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui states that Bolivia was occupied, but the population in Bolivia was never defeated. The indigenous communities remained places of autonomy where the colonial system had no cultural power. So the idea of a gated world of separated spaces, which also points out Mbembe, was applied in Bolivia. So since they needed the labor, first forced work labor, they couldn't make enslaved people from Africa work in the highlands because it was too high. They just created these communities. They created the word of indigenous, and they created the word of the Spanish. The word of the indigenous group, Aymara, describes Montes Ruiz as a place of light and shadow. Whereas in the colonial centers, in the towns, plantations, and mines, control was totalitarian. In the communities in rural areas, the Aymara could rest from oppressive measures executed by the colonizers. This is the world of light, where the Aymara personality can breathe and could also survive in a way. The other side, on the other side, the colonial places is the world of shadow, where they feel the loss of status and control over body, where they were driven into mines, where there were servants and nothing else. So in this state of colonial power, the people in Bolivia developed an interesting cultural, artistic contestation of one of the colonial system, and on the other hand of to maintain their own cultural habits and own cultural ideas alive within the cultural system. And this is what I want in the following explain in this presentation. So especially the question of autonomous spaces can be explained by the idea of cultural practices. And the people were doing this within Catholic processions. So they started performing by dancing within Catholic processions, which were still allowed because the Spanish Inquisition and the Spanish masters wanted them to be Catholic. So there was one place where they could in public show their own cultural habits. And so their they developed some certain forms of cultural habits, of cultural practices, which allowed them to maintain their culture. And in this this came out that dance in the procession became a living resistance, because the religious celebration transformed into a dissident state, as Aldama Ordóñez points out. And it became also, over the time, challenging the political and cultural colonial system. And I want to show this at the nowadays system of fiesta. So we have nowadays a system of fiesta in Bolivia, where a lot of people are taking place. Everybody, many people are part of the fraternidades, which are brotherhoods, which are organizing one small little procession in the Bolivian society nowadays. They have a special sort of dance. They all these dances have pre-Columbian references and symbols of the own cosmovision. They are, but they are, even though they are coming from the 16th century under the siege of the colonial system, they are still executed nowadays as a living cultural expression, and they are still nowadays alive. So they are contemporary cultural practices, which mostly or many times are called traditional, but I would not say that they are traditional. They are a contemporary form defying the colonial system. I wanted to bring you this a little bit closer by the devil's dance, which is one dance which is danced quite often in these processions. The processions nowadays are called entradas, and the devil's dance is a reference to the deity of the mountains, which is the Tío, and the Tío translated in English is the uncle. So the uncle is a deity of the mountains, which helps the mining person, the miner, to get silver, to find the metals he needed. So he worships him, but he is also the devil. So he's the devil in a Christian way. But to show, so the possibility original to show that the devil can dance in the streets on a Catholic procession, which was a contestation of the system in itself, because the devil is the fallen angel within the Christian mythology. They just used as a sign to the colonizers that that this dance is within the Christian idea. They have the archangel Gabriel, who is controlling the dance of the devil. Then you have another symbol, which is the snake or the paddock, which symbolizes the Pachamama, which is something of Mother Earth within the pre-Hispanic culture in Bolivia. And we have this origin of the dance in the 16th century, as many of the other ones, but it's nowadays also presented, is still presented in this way, even though it's not presented within Catholic processions, because not all the entradas and all the processions which are happening, or most of them are not, are under control of the Catholic Church. It's more vice versa. The processions have become a popular mass movement, and there are 17 or 20 dances more, which have all in a different way references to the colonial system, references to the class system, references to pre-Hispanic cultural values, and they are all danced, some of them together in the big entradas, in the big processions. Other ones, small processions, only have one dance. So, so it's obviously that the colonial dance has, the devil dance has anti-colonial roots, and that there is the tactic at the initial stage was to maintain cultural practices. But nowadays, we can talk about it as a mass movement. We have approximately 1,000 processions that take place in La Paz and El Alto every day. That means every day we have around 3 processions where people are dancing with their different dances, and the Diabla is one of the principal dances. So you have in the big procession as the Grand Poder, you have 50,000 dancers dancing their dances, and there they're not only dancing the Diablada, but also other dances like the Morenada, which have references to the enslaved people from Africa, the Caporal, the dance which makes which is a reference to the slaveholders and making an ironic reference to them. The miners dance, which helps or which shows the power of the miners and the significance of the miners and all this. So it's a massive echo you have nowadays from this past, this colonial past, contesting or defying the colonial system under very, very difficult conditions nowadays in the present time, in a form where it's no longer a need to hide your own cultural traditions, your old cultural habits you want to have. And this is, and we heard Sarah before, and we heard Heike before, the question of avant-garde, where we have, is avant-garde something that is linked to progress and evolution? Is it something that is ahead and shows something to come? Is it a cultural practice which is at the beginning exercised by a minority and an avant-gardist minority, or becomes later mainstream, for instance, like it became in pop art? At the beginning, it was not considered as art, and it was only made by a few people in New York. And later it became a major art current. So the question is, if we talk about avant-garde in questions of time, it is linked to progress, and it is linked to a continuing time. And this is basically something where you would say these dances are not linked to progression, but they are more an echo from the past. But why? And this is something I would like to discuss later on also. Why I see this as avant-garde practice is, once the question of having another avant-garde, or in the core, there's the question of having or questioning avant-garde in its the term of avant-garde, and seeing tradition as avant-garde practice when you get another sort of time concept. The time concept which is in Bolivia or plays a role is the time concept of cyclist time. And this is not, and so there's not the idea of modern, not traditional, developed, not underdeveloped avant-garde, and that constantly steps forward and it never steps back. And avant-garde is anti-traditional, is not valid in this idea of cyclist time. The concept is the space and time is not separable in the idea of Aymara cosmovision time. It's a cyclic time idea of Andean cosmovision, and the idea is, I mentioned before, Pachamama as Mother Earth, but this is also some sort of not really showing what is the concept of Pacha, because the concept of Pacha is central in symbolism and philosophic ideas in the Andean highlands, and it means that time and space and time are linked together, and they are not separable, and that in this concept of time, progress is not conceivable in a linear way, which, for instance, questions the question, can the past perish, or what means if the past perish and the future comes, and what means it for avant-garde concept? As Heike stated in the example she brought, if we see that the past and the present and the future can be one, or is one in a time concept, and that linear time of avant-gardistic concepts are not valid, or are from this perspective don't play a big role. So reinvention or reenactment of tradition within the colonial place has in this case an avant-gardist notion, as long as it contests and defies the colonial system and the post-colonial system, and is becoming also a mass movement. And even though it maintains traditional elements within this, and even though it becomes a mass movement executed by or practiced by a lot of people. So the past can be avant-gardist, and the past popular dances in Bolivia coming from the past are in this idea of avant-gardism progressive, or are avant-gardist in this idea of time. So this is what the core idea of my presentation was. I hope I was, or I am, within the time, the linear time, the chronological time we have, and want to thank you for your attention. And I will stop sharing now.